They say the first fall wasn't in Eden, it was in the sky. And if you listen closely, somewhere between myth and memory, you can still hear it. The sound of wings folding, the quiet shock of light surrendering to gravity. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleep Atlas, where we travel through the hidden corners of history, mythology, and time. Stories designed not to startle you awake, but to gently pull you into sleep through wonder. If you're new here, go ahead and dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and let this one wash over you. Tonight's story takes us far before written civilization, before empires, before gods took names, into a forgotten world described only in fragments of ancient parchment, the Book of Giants. It's one of the strangest and oldest tales humanity ever tried to remember. It's a story that exists half in scripture, half in whisper, a cosmic tragedy that begins not with a war but with fascination, because before there were demons or saints or myths of paradise lost, there were the Watchers, angels who looked down at earth and felt something they weren't supposed to feel. We're going to explore what happened when curiosity outweighed obedience, when the divine decided to live among mortals. It's a tale that sits at the root of nearly every ancient story about a flood, about forbidden love, about civilizations rising too fast and falling too hard. But don't worry, you don't need to believe in angels or apocrypha to enjoy this one. Just let it unfold like a dream. For the next couple of hours, we'll drift slowly through that ancient world, where light and shadow were still deciding who got to rule, where giants walked among men, and where a single act of curiosity changed everything. So before we begin, take a slow breath in and out. You've probably had a long day, so this is your moment to unwind. Maybe you're listening in bed or on a late night walk or somewhere quiet where the world finally feels slower. Either way, welcome. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments and tell me what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy these calm journeys through forgotten history, remember to subscribe so you never miss another story. We explore history's strangest corners, not for answers, but for peace. Now, close your eyes if you want to. Let's go back to the time before the flood, before Noah, before even Adam and Eve were legends, to a moment when heaven looked down and decided to visit earth. Chapter 1. When the angels fell. They say curiosity was humanity's first sin. But what if it wasn't ours at all? What if it began above the clouds, among beings who were supposed to know better? Imagine it. The earth still young, warm and breathing, the continents raw and jagged, forests heavy with mist, the air thick with the scent of rain and soil, untouched, alive, unjudged, and above it all, a light that never quite sets, the shimmering realm of the Watchers. The Watchers weren't warriors or saints. They were observers, sent to study, to guide quietly, to make sure the grand experiment of humanity didn't burn itself out too soon. You could think of them as cosmic overseers with divine clearance, celestial scientists with wings, and for a while it all worked. They watched from the edges of clouds, recording the rhythms of the earth like astronomers noting the movement of stars. But then, as always, something changed. The story says it began with sight, a single glance downward, perhaps innocent at first, then lingering, because the Watchers saw something unexpected. They saw beauty, not divine, not perfect, human beauty, flesh and motion and laughter, imperfect, fragile, but alive in a way heaven wasn't. In one of the oldest fragments from the book of Enoch, it says they looked down and saw that the daughters of men were fair. A simple sentence, but it carried the weight of cosmic consequence. Samyaza, their leader, was the first to speak aloud what the others were thinking. "Let us go down," he said, "and take wives among them." The others hesitated. Angels weren't supposed to feel desire, let alone act on it. They were the watchers, not the participants, the sky's quiet sentinels, not its poets. But fascination is infectious. Samyaza's reasoning was simple. If all of them descended together, none could be blamed alone. So, one by one, they agreed, 200 in all. They swore an oath atop Mount Hermon, a solemn, radiant summit lost now to time. The ancient texts say they bound themselves by mutual imprecations, which is a very old-fashioned way of saying if we fall together. And with that, they stepped through the veil. Imagine the scene, the sky torn open by silent fire, beings of light folding their wings, descending like comets, landing not with thunder, but with the hush of something sacred breaking. The mountains trembled, rivers slowed, and humans looked up and saw their gods walking. The world had never seen beauty like that, nor danger. At first, the watchers brought gifts. They were teachers more than tyrants. They taught humans how to till the ground properly, how to forge metal, how to understand the stars. They shared the secrets of writing, of medicine, of ornamentation. Civilization bloomed almost overnight. The world went from campfires to kingdoms, from mud to monuments. If you're listening in the dark, try to picture it. The first sparks of iron against stone, the smell of new forged blades, the shimmer of painted cloth. Humanity, for the first time, felt immortal. But here's the quiet tragedy. Knowledge never travels alone. Every gift carries its own shadow. With metal came weapons, with medicine came poison, with writing came lies, and the angels, well, they started to forget they were supposed to be impartial. Azazel, one of the brightest among them, taught the secrets of warfare and weaponry. He showed men how to forge swords, how to polish shields, how to paint their faces before battle. He was an innovator, maybe the first influencer really, but his audience learned faster than he expected. Others taught enchantments, charms, and the reading of stars. Soon, humanity wasn't just learning, they were experimenting. The sacred knowledge meant to guide them turned into the very thing that divided them. Villages became cities, cities became kingdoms, and kingdoms learned to kill. And the angels, those who had once watched from afar, started watching each other instead. Samyaza, their leader, began to sense something was unraveling. He'd started a revolution of beauty and curiosity, but now he saw what divine interference looked like up close. The earth was becoming louder, hotter, more violent. The balance was shifting, and somewhere between heaven and earth, something else began to stir. The union of the watchers and the daughters of men created something new, something colossal, luminous, and deeply wrong, the first of the giants. The fragments say they were born glowing, but their glow didn't last. They grew too quickly, towering over the forests, hungry beyond reason, brilliant but wild. Imagine the sound of their footsteps, like drums in the soil, the earth itself trying to move out of their way. The watchers were awed, maybe even proud at first. Their children were proof of their rebellion, and for a time, the world belonged to them. Humanity worshipped them as gods, offering harvests and songs, but it didn't take long for the songs to turn into prayers of fear. Because the giants weren't built for balance, they were built from contradiction, part divine, part flesh, too strong to be human, too flawed to be holy. Their hunger was endless. They consumed more than the world could give, and when food ran out, they turned on the world itself. By then, the Watchers had realized what they'd done. The earth was breaking under their feet. Crops failed, storms grew strange, animals vanished. The sky, the one they once ruled, grew darker. And in heaven something was stirring too. It's said that the archangels, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, and Gabriel, began to murmur, not in anger, but in sorrow, because what had begun as curiosity had turned into corruption. The experiment had gone rogue. And yet, down on earth, the Watchers couldn't bring themselves to stop. Maybe they loved too deeply. Maybe they feared what would happen if they tried. Maybe, like us, they simply didn't know when to let go. For now, the world stood on the edge of two realms, heaven's silence above, the giant's growing shadow below. And then, one night, the ground began to move, as if the world itself were giving birth to something it shouldn't. For a while, it must have felt like paradise. Imagine being human in those first days after the descent, when angels walked beside you and everything you once feared now had an answer. Storms, stars, sickness, iron, all explained by beings who glowed faintly in the dark. The world felt smaller, maybe even manageable, like the universe had finally decided to share its cheat sheet. The Watchers weren't cruel at first. They were curious. They wanted to see what humanity could become with a little push. They gave knowledge freely: metallurgy, medicine, music, astronomy. Each angel had a different specialty, like divine professors in a school that had never existed before. And the students, humanity, learned fast. Azazel taught the working of metals, the shaping of blades, the making of ornaments. Soon people were decorating their clothes with polished stones, their faces with shimmering powders, their bodies with gold. Civilization began to gleam. Shemyaza taught enchantments and root cutting, the art of herbs and spells. Suddenly every village had a healer, every illness a potion, every prayer a recipe. Barakiel mapped the skies, teaching constellations and calendars. Kokabel taught the knowledge of the stars so that sailors could follow them, kings could name them, and mystics could worship them. And then came Sariel, quiet, meticulous, obsessed with measurement. He gave them the knowledge of the moon and the cycles of time. For the first time, humans understood the rhythm of their world. They built temples aligned to the solstices, monuments that caught the sunrise at precise angles. It was the birth of architecture, mathematics, astrology, all born from borrowed light. You could almost admire them, until you remember that paradise has never handled progress well, because every time knowledge rises faster than wisdom, something breaks. The world became brighter, yes, but it also became sharper. The same hands that forged ornaments learned to forge weapons. The same stars used for farming became signs of conquest. The same herbs that healed could now poison. And the Watchers, who had meant to guide quietly, started watching with pride. Humans began to worship them as gods. They built altars, carved images, sang hymns, and the angels, once humble servants of a silent heaven, started to believe their own statues. Azazel's followers built towers of metal that gleamed under the sun. Women wore gold as if it was skin. Men carried swords as symbols of power, not protection. The air filled with the smell of forged smoke and incense. And somewhere in that haze, the line between divine and mortal blurred completely. Samyaza walked among them, no longer a watcher but a king. He wore no crown, but he didn't need one. His presence was enough, the kind of charisma that makes people forget how to question. They said when he spoke the wind stood still. The angels taught justice too, though theirs was different, a little colder, a little cleaner. They introduced systems of hierarchy and law, but it wasn't the justice of compassion. It was the justice of balance, a kind of cosmic account-keeping. For every sin, a cost. For every cost, a punishment. And humanity, newly wise, learned quickly how to weaponize even fairness. It's one of history's repeating patterns. The gift that becomes a curse the moment we start thinking we own it. If you listen closely to this part of the myth, you can almost hear the tone change. The awe of the first descent gives way to unease. Heaven has gone quiet. The earth hums too loudly. Knowledge has outgrown innocence. The fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls describe this shift in eerie detail. They tell of cities built in impossible places, high on cliffs, under deserts, inside mountains. Of people who carved their names in stone, certain they'd never be forgotten. Of angels who grew restless, teaching ever more dangerous arts just to feel needed. And at the heart of it all, the giants, their children. They learned faster than anyone. Their minds were vast, their strength unmatched. They could reshape the world by accident, and yet, like children of divorced parents, they inherited confusion. The balance between heaven and earth lived inside them as contradiction. They were wise but wild, powerful but lost. The ancient texts say they were great men of renown, the first heroes, the first tyrants. They built fortresses taller than mountains, hunted for sport, spoke to stars. Some claimed to hear the voice of God still. Others swore the heavens had gone blind. And that's where the story begins to shift from myth to warning, because when divine knowledge meets mortal impulse, the results are rarely subtle. The Watchers had given humanity the tools to rule nature, but they couldn't teach restraint. You can hear the cynicism buried in those old lines. Even 2,000 years ago, the writers knew this wasn't a story about angels, it was a story about us. The gifts turned the world beautiful, then brittle. The sky filled with smoke, rivers darkened, the air shimmered with heat from forges and fires. The night, once silent, echoed with the clash of iron and the chanting of new gods, and somewhere in that noise the first cracks appeared. Crops began to fail, seasons turned unpredictable. The giants, now grown beyond measure, devoured what was left. Their hunger became legend. They consumed the land, the animals, and finally the people who had once worshipped them. But before the horror, there was still beauty. There's always a quiet interlude before the flood. So imagine this: twilight falling over an ancient city, its streets lined with torches, its towers reaching into clouds. The Watchers walk among mortals, radiant and tired. Music drifts through the air, flutes carved from bone, drums from hollowed wood. A mother tells her child to look at the stars, never knowing that soon those same stars will turn away, because the heavens were already restless. The other angels and the loyal ones watched in silence. They saw the gifts turn to corruption, the balance tipping toward ruin. And somewhere beyond the stars, the Creator waited, not in anger, but in patience, the kind of patience that precedes consequence. Samyaza still believed he could fix it. He told his followers that heaven wouldn't punish them, that their love for humanity was noble, that knowledge could never be a sin. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he just couldn't face what came next. But Azazel, the Bright One, had stopped pretending. He taught men to make war not out of fear, but for sport. His cities glittered with steel and blood. He became the symbol of brilliance turned bitter, the first to understand that rebellion, once begun, has no graceful exit. It's strange how modern the story feels, progress racing ahead, reason lagging behind, arrogance disguised as enlightenment. The more things change, the more ancient they sound. And so the watchers continued their work. The giants grew restless, and the earth began to feel smaller under their weight. The balance of heaven and earth had broken, and neither side seemed willing to admit it. Then one night, the sky dimmed, not from clouds, but from absence. The stars, the same ones the watchers had taught humanity to read, began to vanish one by one, as if heaven had decided to stop watching back. And down below, the world carried on shining, too brightly, too loudly, too soon. The gifts of the watchers had changed everything, but like every light left on too long, it was about to burn out. There's a point in every story of progress where the applause becomes uncomfortable. At first, people celebrate discovery. They sing about it, carve it into stone, teach their children to honor it. But then, slowly, that same discovery begins to ask questions no one knows how to answer. That's where this story settles now, somewhere between admiration and dread. The world that the watchers had built glittered, but too brightly. Cities rose faster than they could be sustained. Knowledge was everywhere, but wisdom had wandered off to sulk in the hills. Humanity had learned to imitate the divine, but not to restrain it. You could say that curiosity itself had become the new god. At first, that must have felt liberating. Imagine a time when every question had a teacher, when every mystery had an answer standing right in front of you. The watchers walked among humans like living encyclopedias, beautiful, patient, occasionally arrogant. The line between mentor and deity blurred more each day, and that's the moment curiosity tips into something else, control. Azazel, the bright one, grew impatient with the limits of teaching. He wanted results. He wanted to see how far humanity could go if it stopped fearing the heavens entirely. He taught warfare not as defense, but as art. He trained men to polish armor like mirrors, to make death look beautiful. He whispered that glory was just another word for rebellion, and humanity listened. The world became noisy. Clanging metal, marching feet, shouted prayers. The old songs of harvest and peace gave way to chants of victory and dominance. It wasn't just war that changed, it was the reason for it. They fought not for food or land, but for the thrill of creation, for the power to shape, to unmake, to play at being gods. Even the stars, once symbols of mystery, were now trophies, mapped, charted, named, owned. It's ironic, isn't it? Every civilization does this. The moment we start to understand the universe, we stop listening to it. The ancient fragments describe this era with a strange kind of poetry. The air was said to shimmer with dust and heat. Rivers ran thick from overuse. The night skies dimmed, not because the stars vanished, but because smoke rose too high to see them. And in that growing haze, the first whispers of regret began to stir. Samyaza, once radiant, began to fade. His voice, once thunder, now sounded weary. The weight of leadership, or maybe guilt, started to show. He'd brought heaven to earth, but at what cost? His angels had become rulers, his students had become soldiers, and the creatures born of their union, the giants, had grown too large to ignore. The texts say they could reach the clouds, though that might be metaphor. Still, imagine a being whose shadow could cover a field, whose hunger could strip a forest. They were brilliant, impulsive, and utterly alien. They called themselves the sons of heaven, and for a while, no one argued. The giants were both miracle and mistake. They built vast monuments and impossible machines, but they also consumed everything. The earth, the animals, even the people who worshipped them. They weren't cruel exactly, just insatiable, like children who never learned the word enough. Some accounts say they tried to speak with heaven, others say they mocked it. Either way, heaven stayed silent, and silence, in myths, always means judgment is near. But before that reckoning came, the Watchers and their children did what intelligent beings always do when they feel something slipping away. They went looking for more. The first sin of curiosity wasn't rebellion, it was obsession. The Watchers began experimenting with creation itself. They mixed bloodlines, tested metals, charted the movement of stars with new precision. Their curiosity became a fever. They wanted to understand how heaven made life, not to destroy it, but to imitate it. It's almost endearing, really. Divine beings trying to build a better version of themselves. But the universe doesn't tolerate duplication well. The more they experimented, the more reality buckled. Crops failed, seasons twisted, storms gathered in places they shouldn't. The balance was gone, and even the earth began to protest. The fragments of the Book of Giants are damaged here, but what remains feels almost mournful. It speaks of the earth crying out, of the groaning of creation, and of the Watchers who watched too long. It's hard not to sympathize. They didn't fall because they hated heaven. They fell because they loved the world too much. They wanted to improve it, to perfect it, to make it shine, and in doing so, they forgot that perfection always erases the thing it loves. Azazel's pride, Samyaza's guilt, the giant's hunger, all of it flowed from the same source, a curiosity that no longer knew when to stop. Even the humans began to notice something was wrong. The weather changed, the soil turned thin, and the great cities started to crumble from within. The Watchers' temples, once filled with song, began to echo. People whispered that the gods had grown tired, and above them, heaven waited. Still silent, still patient. It's in this quiet, this pause before the fall, that the story starts to feel eerily familiar. We've all lived through it in smaller ways. Every era thinks its inventions will save it, right up until they don't. Every empire believes it's different, right up until the cracks appear. The names change, the technology changes, but the rhythm is the same. The Book of Giants just tells it on a cosmic scale. There's one line that scholars always point out, found in a fragment from Qumran, written in faint Aramaic ink. And they rejoiced in their knowledge until their shadows grew longer than the sun. It's haunting, isn't it? That idea that knowledge itself casts a shadow, that light, left unchecked, becomes its own kind of darkness. So the Watchers kept teaching, the giants kept growing, and the world kept trembling. The earth was full of brilliance, but none of it could make anyone happy. The more they learned, the less peace they found. Curiosity had finally eaten wonder, and as the balance slipped further, as the sky began to thrum with unspoken judgment, something began to move deep underground. A pulse, a heartbeat, a reminder that the world itself was alive and listening. The first sin of curiosity was complete, and soon the earth would answer. The earth always knows before we do. It can sense imbalance long before our minds can name it, before the stories turn into warnings, before the warnings become too late. In those ancient days, the world itself began to shudder, not violently yet, but like a creature in restless sleep. The Watchers noticed first. They were attuned to the rhythm of creation, even as they ignored its boundaries. Rivers flowed differently, stars flickered when they shouldn't, and animals grew silent for no reason. It wasn't a catastrophe yet, just a quiet misalignment, a feeling that something enormous was moving beneath the surface of the world. Some of the Watchers pretended not to notice. Others whispered to one another in secret, their voices echoing like wind through stone halls. Samyaza grew withdrawn, Azazel grew restless, and humanity, well, humanity had other problems, because their gods, their luminous teachers, were no longer united. The humans could feel it in the air. The angels had grown distant, distracted, and strange. The lessons that once brought light now came with unease. Metallurgy turned to weaponsmithing. Astrology turned to prophecy and fear. The stars were no longer guides, they were omens. The world was beginning to feel heavy with foreknowledge. And then came the children. The ancient texts say their birth was both miracle and mistake, that the very earth groaned beneath them. No one knows what they looked like exactly. The word giant conjures images of monstrous size, but the old scrolls describe something subtler and somehow more unsettling. They were radiant, beautiful, and terrible all at once. Their eyes, it said, were like fire underwater. At first, the people adored them. They seemed like proof that the Watchers had done something right, that heaven's light could be mixed with mortal life and survive. The children of angels and humans were hailed as a new order of beings, stronger, wiser, more perfect. But perfection doesn't stay still for long. The giants, the Nephilim as later texts would call them, grew rapidly, both in stature and ambition. They learned faster than their teachers, understood more than their parents, and hungered for everything the world could offer. Their bodies, the texts say, drank the strength of the sun, and their voices carried for miles. They built temples to themselves. They carved images into mountains. They learned to bend metal and stone as easily as clay. Humanity looked up at them and saw both hope and doom. You can almost picture it, a world of impossible scale, full of half-divine beings striding through clouds of dust, building things no one would ever match again. Maybe that's where our myths of lost cities come from. Places so grand they could only have been built by something more than human. But with every step they took, the ground beneath them ached. The fragments of the Book of Giants describe this as the swelling of the earth, its poetic language for something catastrophic. Crops began to fail again, not from drought, but from overconsumption. The soil was tired. The animals fled deeper into forests and caves. The humans, caught between angels and their children, grew desperate. And the giants, who had been worshipped as gods, began to hunger for more than food. It started small, the first hunts, the first sacrifices, but soon the texts say they consumed all that the earth produced, and when nothing was left, they turned against all flesh. It's here that the story stops feeling divine and starts feeling disturbingly human. Because the giants weren't monsters by nature, they were creatures of appetite, the kind we still recognize. They wanted endlessly, and no amount of having could make them full. The world had become a feast too small for its guests, and beneath that chaos, something ancient stirred, the earth itself, straining to hold what was never meant to exist. Mountains cracked, storms gathered, and even the stars seemed to recoil. There's one fragment badly damaged but chilling in its simplicity. It says, "The heavens remembered their silence, and the earth remembered its boundaries." In other words, judgment was already in motion. The watchers watching still began to sense it. They felt their power dim, their wings grow heavy, their light fading like dying embers. They had touched something sacred, and in doing so, they'd awakened the immune system of creation. Even Samyaza, proud and sorrowful, began to dream of collapse. His followers whispered of strange omens, meteors falling from the sky, rivers that ran red with clay, voices in the wind that sounded like crying. Meanwhile, Azazel only laughed. He had stopped believing in redemption. "The world is ours now," he said, "and heaven has forgotten it." He built cities of glass and metal, taught men to make mirrors and weapons, and called it freedom. But the others weren't so sure. They could feel the weight of the flood long before a single drop of rain fell. The Book of Giants preserves fragments of their dreams, eerie, apocalyptic visions. The giants, too, began to see the signs. They dreamt of collapsing mountains, of the sky splitting open, of light pouring down like water. They woke, screaming, terrified of their own prophecy. Some of them begged the watchers to intercede with heaven, others cursed their makers for bringing them into being, and the humans below, caught in between, began to pray for the end of both. You can almost hear the silence before the storm, the pause between guilt and consequence. It's the same quiet that falls before every collapse in history. The sound of something magnificent realizing it's gone too far. The world had become both masterpiece and mistake. Too beautiful to last, too broken to survive. The earth trembled, the sky dimmed, and for the first time since the angels had fallen, even they looked upward again, because somewhere beyond the stars, something was moving, patient, fast, and mercifully inevitable. The story of the giants was about to begin. If you were standing on the earth in those days, you might have thought the world was growing. The mountains felt taller. The valleys seemed to deepen overnight. The sky itself looked closer, as if heaven and earth were still adjusting to their new, uncomfortable marriage. And somewhere in that uneasy space between light and soil, the giants were born. No one writes about the sound of their arrival, but you can imagine it. Not thunder, not shouting, but a low vibration that shook everything alive. The ground trembled, rivers twisted from their beds, and animals fled to places they'd never seen before. The ancient fragments simply say, "And the earth groaned." It's one of those quiet biblical sentences that says far more than it seems to. The children of angels and mortals were not meant to exist, but they existed anyway, and like all impossible things, they were magnificent and doomed. Their names drift through the fragments like fading echoes, Ohya, Hahya, Mahaway. Each carries the weight of myth, but they feel strangely human. They fought, they dreamed, they feared, they learned. They were the first beings to live with both divine ambition and mortal weakness, and that contradiction shaped everything they touched. Imagine seeing one for the first time, a being taller than the trees, eyes like liquid bronze, voice deep enough to make the wind hesitate. They were radiant, not grotesque. The earliest stories describe them as luminous, their skin almost translucent, as if light still remembered them. For a moment, they must have looked like gods, and yet their hunger betrayed them. The fragments say that the giants devoured the toil of men. They ate everything the world could give, not out of cruelty, just because they could. Their bodies burned with the energy of both heaven and earth, and that balance demanded constant fuel. At first, the humans worshipped them, offerings of fruit, of grain, of animals, anything to please their enormous, radiant offspring. The giants accepted with childlike joy. But when the offerings ran out, they began to take what they needed. They hunted not for food, but for survival. The forests thinned, the rivers darkened, and the smell of smoke became the scent of every dawn. The world's first apocalypse wasn't fire or flood, it was appetite. And yet, in the middle of all that chaos, there were moments of strange tenderness. Some fragments describe the giants as mournful, even gentle. They loved music. They painted symbols on their bodies and sang in languages that no longer exist. They weren't born evil, they were born misfit, too vast for the world that bore them, too mortal for heaven to reclaim. Their dreams, the ones recorded on the ancient scrolls, tell us more than their actions do. They dreamed of falling stars, of the sun darkening, of mountains being swallowed by the sea. Some begged their fathers, the Watchers, to explain the visions. Others demanded to know why they had been created only to be destroyed. Mahaway, one of the few giants given real dialogue in the surviving texts, becomes a kind of tragic hero. He's the one sent to find Enoch, the prophet who still walks with heaven. Even in a story this old, you can feel the weight of that mission. A creature born of rebellion, flying to beg for forgiveness that isn't his to give. But we're not there yet. For now, the world still breathes, still holds them. The earth hasn't decided what to do with its impossible children. The Watchers watch, as they always have, some with pride, some with shame. They see their children towering above forests, building palaces of stone and bone, carving the names of their fathers into mountainsides. They've remade the world in their image, vast, glittering, fragile, and above it all, heaven remains silent. There's a haunting irony in that silence. The Watchers had once begged heaven to notice them, to sanction their love, their curiosity, their rebellion. Now that they have what they wanted, dominion, admiration, legacy, they find themselves longing for the quiet approval they once ignored. Maybe that's what guilt sounds like. Not thunder or punishment, but silence that lasts too long. The giants grow restless, their bodies, their appetites, their strange dreams, all of it feels like prophecy. The earth groans again, the rivers seem to flow backward, the sky darkens without reason, and then, in one fragment, a single line, they became aware of their end. It's such a human sentence, no divine flourish, no judgment, just awareness, the kind of realization that comes when you finally see the shadow your own light has been casting. That's how the first chapter of this story ends, not with war, not with wrath, but with recognition. The world is now crowded with beings that should never have been, and every breath they take feels like a countdown. The Watchers stand atop their mountains, staring up at the quiet stars, wondering if heaven is watching back. The humans pray to anything that will listen, and deep within the earth, something old begins to stir, a pulse, a whisper, a promise, because creation always remembers its rules, and it was about to remind them all. So when we say, the ground began to move as if the world itself were giving birth to something it shouldn't, what we really mean is this: the world was no longer giving birth, it was preparing to reclaim its children. Chapter 2: The Children of Heaven and Earth. If Chapter 1 was the descent, Chapter 2 is the bloom, the strange, shimmering age that followed the Watcher's fall. The flood has not yet come. Heaven is still silent. The world, for a fleeting moment, belongs to the giants. Imagine waking into that world. The air itself hums differently, thicker somehow, like a dream that hasn't decided whether to be beautiful or terrifying. The dawns are golden and strange, the nights heavy with light that isn't quite moonlight. The forests, swollen with rain and time, reach higher than they do now. Rivers curve like serpents across the plains, glittering with reflections of impossible architecture. And in those lands where angels once walked and men once knelt, now stride the Nephilim, the children of heaven and earth. They are not yet monsters, not yet the beings of horror whispered about in apocryphal texts and sermons. At first, they are just new, vast, luminous, and full of unspent purpose. The fragments describe them as radiant, their veins filled with fire that remembers the stars. Their eyes burn with gold light, their voices are described as like trumpets under the sea. They speak softly but carry the weight of thunder. For humanity, their presence must have felt like living inside a miracle. Cities sprang up in their shadows, people built temples at their feet and carved prayers into their walls. The giants were worshipped not as kings, but as living extensions of the divine, half gods who could speak to the heavens and touch the soil in the same breath. They didn't need thrones, their existence was authority. The Watchers, now the uneasy fathers of this new world, watched with pride and dread. They saw their children mastering arts they themselves had barely understood. Metallurgy, geometry, agriculture, language, medicine, sorcery. The Nephilim didn't just inherit knowledge, they amplified it. In some stories, it's said that they built cities of light. Imagine vast terraces of marble and bronze, temples aligned perfectly to the stars, gardens that never wilted. The air would have smelled of wet stone and smoke from forges, the sound of hammering echoing through mountains. Humanity looked at their work and thought, this must be what heaven looks like. But of course, it wasn't heaven. It was earth under strain. Every new creation, every tower, every statue, every mine demanded something from the land. The more the Nephilim built, the more the world bent beneath them. Rivers dried, hills shifted, the air grew warmer, full of metal and song. The Book of Giants fragments speak of this time not as a rain, but as a fever. The world was alive, but sick with light. And yet, within the fever, there was wonder. The giants taught humans arts that would echo for millennia, the making of glass, the shaping of cities, the mapping of stars. They wrote poems that stretched for days, composed music that required mountains to echo properly. They were beings of impossible scale, trying desperately to fill the emptiness that came with it. But their hunger was growing too. Not just for food, though that would become a problem soon enough, but for meaning, for connection, for recognition from the heaven that had abandoned them. Some of the Nephilim climbed the highest peaks and shouted prayers upward, waiting for an answer that never came. Others turned inward, building temples and altars, sacrificing animals, sometimes even people, trying to buy favor from a god who had gone quiet. The silence became unbearable. And silence, when it lasts too long, always becomes noise. The Watchers tried to keep order, but even they had grown weary. Their wings had lost their brilliance, their once immortal forms dimmed by time and gravity. They walked among their children as fading lights, respected but pitied. Azazel, once the most dazzling among them, had become something else entirely. His beauty was now terrible, the beauty of fire, not light. He taught his followers how to shape destruction, molten metal, sharper blades, tools of command and control. To him, survival was progress. To others, it was blasphemy. And yet, his cities thrived. From their forges came weapons unlike any seen before. From their towers came smoke that blotted the sun. And from their people came songs of pride and grief intertwined, hymns for gods that didn't answer. This was the paradox of the Giants' Age. Everything was magnificent and everything was dying. But of course, no one saw it that way yet. Every civilization thinks it's eternal while it still glows. The texts describe this as the age when the air trembled. The earth still held together, but it had begun to remember that it could fall apart. The giants continued to rise, their cities spread across continents, their towers scraping the sky. And in every one of those towers they left carvings, images of themselves looking upward, waiting for heaven's gaze. It never came. Instead, what came was the slow, invisible weight of consequence. The skies dimmed slightly each season, the crops grew less fertile, the rivers changed color. It wasn't wrath, it was withdrawal. Creation was beginning to reclaim its balance, inch by inch, heartbeat by heartbeat. But the giants didn't see it. They couldn't. They were still glowing, still building, still convincing themselves that silence meant approval. The fragments end this section with a haunting image, one line that feels almost like prophecy. They rejoiced in the glory of their works until even their shadows forgot to move. That's how it always begins, isn't it? Not with fire or thunder, but with the stillness that comes right before. There's a point in every golden age when the light gets too bright to look at. The world doesn't end, not yet, but it begins to ache. For the giants, the ache started as hunger. At first, it was manageable. The Nephilim were vast. Their bodies demanded more than the earth had ever provided. Fields were expanded, rivers redirected, mountains hollowed for farmland. Humanity labored to feed them, and for a time the arrangement held. The people brought their harvests to the cities of the giants, singing hymns of gratitude and fear in equal measure. The scrolls tell us the earth was generous then. Grains grew taller than men, fruit ripened year-round, herds stretched to the horizon. But nature, like heaven, has a limit. When the soil began to thin, the watchers urged moderation. The giants laughed, gently at first, then bitterly. They couldn't stop eating any more than stars could stop burning. And so they took. The Book of Giants describes it almost clinically. They devoured all the acquisitions of men until men could no longer sustain them. But between those lines you can hear the quiet panic, the sound of humanity realizing that its gods were starving. The world grew loud with desperation. Forests fell faster than they could regrow. Rivers ran low. Smoke hung above the horizon like a permanent twilight. The cities that had once glittered with gold now reeked of decay. Even the music changed, from hymns of creation to chants for survival. The Nephilim's hunger became more than physical, it was spiritual. They consumed everything: art, labor, worship, love. They wanted attention as much as sustenance. They needed to be seen, to be adored, to be feared. It wasn't enough to rule. They wanted to fill the emptiness that heaven's silence had left behind, but nothing filled it. That's the curse of beings born of two worlds. They carry twice the appetite and half the peace. At first, the humans tried to appease them. They offered sacrifices, not symbolic ones, but real. Livestock, harvests, sometimes even their own kin. The texts don't linger on it, but you can imagine the sound, the low hum of prayers spoken with trembling voices, and the giants accepted. But hunger, once indulged, only grows. They began to take what was not offered. The scrolls say, they devoured all flesh, from the beasts of the field to the sons of men. It's said in that detached, ancient way, but you can feel the horror under the language. This was no longer a partnership. It was collapse disguised as devotion. The watchers were horrified, or most of them were. Azazel, the rebel teacher, only smiled. They are what they were born to be, he said. We gave them the fire of heaven. What did you expect, that they would eat dust? Samyaza, wearied and ashamed, tried to contain them. He spoke to his fellow watchers about restraint, about returning to the old balance. But the others were fracturing. Some sided with their children, seeing them as the next step in creation. others fled, vanishing into mountains or seas, hoping to escape what they had made. But you can't escape consequence. The world began to feel crowded with unease. The birds flew lower, the winds grew erratic, and the nights stretched longer. Even the stars, those silent observers, seemed to dim. The humans, trapped between heaven's silence and earth's fury, began to pray to anyone who would listen. Some begged the watchers for protection, others cursed them outright. The once glorious temples of stone and gold became fortresses filled with smoke and fear, and still the giants grew. They outlived seasons, their bodies demanding more even as the land gave less. The old texts say that when one walked, the earth bent beneath their weight. Some began to sink their palaces into the ground, digging downward instead of upward, searching for hidden fire, the earth's warmth to replace the fading sun. It's hard not to see the symbolism. They were children of the sky, now driven into the soil. There's a line in the fragments that stands out. They sought to feed upon the root of the world. It's unclear if that means literal mining or something stranger. A desperate attempt to consume the very essence of life itself. Either way, it didn't work. The deeper they dug, the emptier they became. It's strange, even in myths, hunger never just means hunger. It means longing, loss, regret. The Nephilim weren't evil by design. They were starving for the one thing they could never taste, belonging. But the earth is patient, and patience is the most dangerous form of wrath. The ground began to change. Crops sprouted hollow, water turned bitter, the air thickened with dust that no wind could clear. Animals grew listless, as though some invisible energy had been drained from the world. And then the dreams began. The giants started to see visions in their sleep, flashes of water, mountains dissolving, fire falling from the sky. They woke trembling, confused. Some wept, others roared, but none understood. They only knew that their hunger was now joined by dread. Even the watchers could feel it. Samyaza's wings, once white as dawn, grew grey. Azazel's eyes, once bright as stars, dimmed to embers. The connection to heaven, once effortless, now felt distant. Their rebellion was aging, and the humans began to whisper again. Not prayers this time, but stories. They spoke of the old gods who would one day wash the world clean. They told their children that the rivers would return, that the sky would open. They didn't know it yet, but they were remembering a prophecy older than memory itself. The world had entered its twilight, golden, terrible, unstoppable. The giants ruled everything. The watchers pretended to, and heaven said nothing at all. But silence, as always, is the sound before the storm. It began quietly, as warnings usually do. Not with thunder or judgment, but with dreams. The giants, those luminous beings of impossible size and appetite, began to sleep restlessly. At first, no one paid attention. The world was already loud, the clang of forges, the chanting of priests, the endless movement of armies. What was one more tremor in a world already shaking? But soon, the dreams grew darker. The fragments of the Book of Giants preserve a few lines written in a hand that trembles even after 2,000 years. And they saw visions in their sleep of destruction upon the earth, of a flood of water and fire, of the fall of kings and mountains. Imagine what it would be like to be one of them, to wake up in a palace carved into a mountain, the air thick with smoke and incense, the horizon still glowing with the light of your own empire, And yet, inside you, there's this image that won't leave. The sea rising, the sun vanishing, the sound of everything you've ever known being erased. At first, they dismissed it. Giants didn't fear dreams. Dreams were for mortals, for weak minds and fragile bodies. But the visions didn't stop. Night after night, they saw the same thing. The sky splitting, the stars bleeding light, the oceans swallowing the land. They tried to explain it away. Some said it was superstition, the residue of too much worship. Others said it was rebellion from the earth itself. A few, the oldest, the most thoughtful among them, whispered that perhaps heaven had started speaking again. And that terrified them more than silence ever had. Because when heaven speaks after silence, it's rarely to comfort. The nightmares spread like a sickness. The Nephilim, unable to sleep, began to pace their halls through the night, muttering about the end. They grew paranoid. Some began to blame the humans, accusing them of cursing the earth through prayer. Others turned on the Watchers, calling them failed gods, cowards who had doomed creation. And the Watchers, those fallen angels, had no answers. They dreamed too. Samyaza dreamt of fire. He saw his own reflection shatter across the surface of a burning sea. Azazel dreamt of chains, bright ones, forged not of iron but of light. Others saw flashes of things they could not name. And when they woke, they said nothing. Heaven was still silent, but now it felt like the silence before judgment. The fragments from Qumran mention 3 giants by name who spoke of their dreams: Oya, Haya, and Mahaway, the brothers, the last generation born before the end. Their stories come to us in pieces, a handful of sentences scattered like broken glass. Oya's dream came first. He saw a stone tablet rise from the sea, covered in writing he could not read. As he stared at it, lightning struck the water, and the tablet shattered into dust. When he woke, he cried out that the world was about to drown. Haya's dream followed. He saw mountains collapse into the valleys, the earth twisting as if alive. From the sky came a torrent of fire and smoke, and the rivers boiled. He said that when the dream ended, he could still hear the sound of the water moving, even when he was awake. And then there was Mahaway, the youngest, and perhaps the most human of them. His dream was simple. He saw his own face reflected in a lake. The water rippled, and when it cleared, the reflection was gone. It's strange how the smallest dream is often the truest one. The brothers gathered the other giants, and they spoke of what they had seen. For the first time, fear crossed their faces. The world that had once adored them now looked fragile, like a painting left too long in the sun. They went to their fathers, the Watchers, and demanded answers. Samyaza said nothing. Azazel laughed. Some of the others tried to comfort them, saying that visions were just echoes, that the earth often trembles before renewal, but the giants could feel the difference. This wasn't renewal, this was return, the world remembering what it was before them. The dreams grew worse. The giants saw the stars dimming. They saw the rivers reverse their flow. They saw animals gathering in pairs and fleeing the cities. They saw humans whispering prayers under their breath. Prayers that didn't include their names anymore. Every night, another vision. Every morning, another denial. Even the Watchers began to speak more quietly, their meetings shrouded in mist and uncertainty. They had once believed their rebellion would make the world divine. Now they saw it only made the divine distant. And above it all, heaven still waited. It's fascinating how this story, buried for millennia, captures a feeling so modern. That sense of living at the edge of something enormous, watching the world tremble, pretending it isn't. The Book of Giants isn't about monsters, really. It's about beings who saw the end coming and couldn't stop themselves from walking toward it anyway. There's a fragment where Mahaway speaks again, his words half ruined by time. The earth has judged itself. No fire, no wrath, no punishment, just consequence. The Nephilim, for all their power, were powerless against that truth. They could move mountains, but not meaning. They could build cities that scraped the sky, but not one that reached heaven. So they gathered the last of them in the great halls their fathers had built. The air was heavy with incense and dust. They whispered their fears to one another, and though none would admit it, each of them hoped the dreams would stop, because deep down they knew what came next. Dreams are warnings that speak gently before the storm has to shout, and the storm was already forming. When the dreams refused to end, the giants decided to do something no one had done in generations. They tried to talk to heaven again, but heaven no longer spoke their language. They had tried praying, burning offerings, even carving messages into the mountains. The wind carried nothing back, the rivers ignored them, and the stars, once their teachers, had gone dim. So they turned to the only being left who might still be heard. His name was Enoch, the man who walked with God. You've probably heard the name before, though maybe not this version. In the Bible, he's little more than a mystery, a line or two saying that he walked with God and was not, for God took him. But in the older texts, in the Book of Enoch, in the Book of Giants, he is the messenger, the scribe of heaven, the one who moves between worlds. If the giants were the children of rebellion, Enoch was the witness to its consequences. The fragments tell us that Mahaway, the youngest and most thoughtful of the giants, was chosen to find him, maybe because he was still curious, still capable of something like hope. His brothers, Ohia and Hahia, had grown too angry to seek forgiveness, but Mahaway still wanted answers. He built himself wings of storm. That's how the texts describe it, wings of wind and cloud, a poetic way of saying he flew, though no one can agree on whether that means literally or symbolically. Maybe it was a vision, maybe it was a journey of the soul. In stories like this, the line doesn't matter. What matters is that he left. The others watched him rise into the sky, a giant among giants growing smaller as he climbed through layers of light and air. Some called after him, begging him to bring back mercy. Others turned away, convinced he'd never return. The journey itself, according to the fragments, was strange and slow. Mahaway passed through the boundaries of the winds, through clouds that shimmered with faces, through silence so vast it hurt to breathe. The world below him looked like a map drawn in fading ink, the forests thinning, the rivers shrinking, the cities of his kind barely flickering. He didn't know what he'd say when he found Enoch. He wasn't even sure if he'd recognize him. What does a being born of heaven and earth say to a man chosen by both? Eventually, the light began to change. The air grew still, the sky flattened into an endless white, and there, in the middle of it, stood a figure, small, calm, and bright in a way that wasn't physical. Enoch. He wasn't radiant like the Watchers or vast like the giants. His light was different, quieter. It was the light of understanding, not power. Mahaway fell to one knee and the ground beneath him trembled. He tried to speak, but his voice shook the clouds, so he whispered instead, the whisper of something huge trying to be small. He told Enoch everything, the descent of the Watchers, the birth of the giants, the dreams of fire and flood, the fear that now lived even in the hearts of the mighty. He asked for guidance, for forgiveness, for some sign that heaven still remembered them. Enoch listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. And when Mahaway finished, he spoke softly, too softly for the giant to fully understand. But what he said was recorded on fragments of stone found centuries later in the Qumran caves. Tell them that they have no peace. The judgment has been decreed. It's hard to imagine how that must have sounded, the first words from heaven in generations, and they were final. Mahaway bowed his head. He wanted to protest, to explain that the giants hadn't chosen to be born, that they were the result of others' sins. But Enoch simply placed a hand upon his forehead, or maybe it was just a gesture, and said, "The earth will cleanse itself." When Mahaway returned, he was silent. The others saw his face and knew. He didn't need to say anything. The watchers tried to demand more details, as if bureaucracy could delay a flood. Azazel mocked him. "So heaven sends a man to tell us what we already know," he said. "How generous." But Samyaza said nothing. He only turned toward the horizon, where storm clouds had begun to gather for the first time in years. The giants felt it too, a shift in the air, a heaviness in their bones. The ground beneath them pulsed like a living thing, and the sky began to hum with pressure. Some of them raged, tearing down their temples in defiance. Others knelt in silence. Mahaway, weary from his journey, simply looked at the sky and whispered a line that has survived across centuries. "The light is returning, and it is not for us." It's one of the most haunting sentences in all of apocryphal literature because it captures what it means to be out of place in creation, to realize that the world's ending isn't cruelty, it's correction. The storm clouds thickened, the rivers swelled, the dreams stopped, and in that sudden stillness, the last age of the giants began to end. When Mahaway returned from his journey, the world seemed to hold its breath. The giants gathered around him, their faces carved with fear and exhaustion. Even the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if waiting for his first word. He said almost nothing, only that Enoch had spoken. Only that heaven had decided that was enough. In that single moment, the age of the giants began to collapse, not with thunder, but with understanding. The prophecy spread through their cities like wind through broken halls. "The earth will cleanse itself," they repeated, the words mutating into prayers, then curses. No one knew exactly what they meant. A flood? A fire? Silence? But everyone felt it, that low vibration beneath the soil, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient waking up. The watchers gathered on the mountains once more. It had been years since they'd dared to meet openly. Their wings were grey now, their faces dim. Even their glow, that faint divine shimmer that once lit entire valleys, had begun to fade. Samyaza spoke first. He asked if anyone still believed they could be forgiven. No one answered. Azazel, ever defiant, laughed quietly. "Forgiven. We made the world magnificent. Even heaven should envy what we've built." But his words rang hollow. The others looked down at the valleys below, at the barren fields, the hollow rivers, the cities trembling under storms. The world no longer looked magnificent. It looked tired. They knew deep down that the prophecy wasn't punishment. It was balance, creation correcting its own equation. The fragments say Enoch sent them a written message afterward, a scroll of fire and ink carried by wind or angel or dream. No one agrees which, but the words were clear enough. The watchers have corrupted the earth. The giants have devoured it. The prayers of the living have reached heaven. The earth itself cries for release. The earth, not heaven, had made the final plea, and that detail changes everything, because it means this wasn't divine vengeance, it was environmental mercy. The world was suffocating under the weight of its own brilliance, and the flood, the cleansing, was simply the universe's way of remembering how to breathe. For the giants, that realization brought no comfort. They were creatures of vastness, their minds as heavy as their bodies. They could grasp concepts like eternity, but not surrender. They didn't know how to stop existing. Some tried to escape. The texts tell of them burrowing deep underground into caverns where the light of the sun cannot reach. Others climbed mountains so high they scraped the edges of the clouds, believing perhaps they could find their father's lost gates to heaven. But heaven had closed its doors. One fragment says that Mahaway himself built a great tower of stone and metal, not to defy heaven, but to witness what was coming. He stood upon it for days, staring at the horizon, watching as clouds began to churn and the air itself thickened with salt. The humans below, meanwhile, began to prepare, not by building, but by praying. Among them, a single man was said to have found favor with heaven. His name, though rarely mentioned in this version of the story, was Noah. But here he is only a shadow, a symbol of survival written into the background of apocalypse. The prophecy had rippled through every layer of creation. Even the animals, the texts claim, began to behave strangely. They migrated in pairs. They gathered near high ground. The earth itself was making room for what would remain. The giants tried to silence the fear with noise, with feasts, with music, with gold. The watchers held rituals of their own, summoning what light they still had left, trying to speak across a heaven that had gone cold. But no sound could climb high enough. The skies were thick now, swirling with color, gray, gold, violet, the hues of a storm that hadn't yet decided what kind of ending it wanted to be. Mahaway walked among his brothers and said softly, "We were meant to build bridges between heaven and earth. Instead, we've become the weight that drags them apart." He wasn't angry, just tired. And that's the quiet tragedy of this part of the story. No one is evil anymore. The rebels are remorseful, the gods are silent, and even the monsters are afraid. All that's left is inevitability. The prophecy was not a threat, it was a clock. Every dream, every tremor, every shift in the sky was another tick forward. The Book of Giants says Enoch wept as he wrote the final words of judgment. He didn't hate them, he pitied them. In his final vision, he saw the earth covered in water, the mountains erased, the stars burning faintly above the waves, and beneath that new world, he saw faint shapes, the remnants of the old one, sinking slowly, like memories dissolving in the dark. The last line of that fragment reads, "And their names were lost, but their voices remained in the deep." It's one of those phrases that stays with you, because even in the mythology of erasure, there's always the hint of something that endures. Maybe that's why the story survived at all, because even when the flood erased the world, memory refused to drown. The prophecy was fulfilled, but the echo of the giants, the sound of their voices, the weight of their mistakes, still lingers beneath everything we build. And as the last drops of calm fell before the storm, the world grew silent again. Heaven had spoken, the earth had agreed, and the sea, waiting patiently at the edges of the land, began to rise. Chapter 3. The Prophet and the Flood. There is a strange kind of silence that comes before the end of things. Not the silence of peace, but of suspension, as if the world itself is holding its breath, listening for what comes next. That's where we are now. The giant's towers still stand, the watchers still walk the mountains, but everything feels paused, even the air, even the light. The dreams have stopped, but the fear hasn't. After Enoch's prophecy, the world seemed to settle into a heavy stillness. No more thunder in the distance, no strange signs in the sky, just a quiet so deep it pressed on the bones. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of waiting. Mahaway, the messenger who had gone to heaven and returned, wandered the valleys alone. He still carried the memory of Enoch's words like a weight he couldn't put down. The earth will cleanse itself. He repeated it to himself often, as if repetition might change its meaning. The watchers had retreated, some into the high places, others deep underground. Samyaza remained on Mount Hermon, the same place where their rebellion had begun. He no longer shone like he once did. His wings were heavy, his voice low. He'd stopped speaking of redemption. Now he only watched the horizon. Azazel was gone. Some said he'd fled into the deserts, others that he'd been bound already, hidden in darkness somewhere beneath the earth. His followers still whispered his name, but even their prayers had grown weak. And the humans, they had started to rebuild, though they didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct, maybe hope. They didn't know a flood was coming, not exactly, but they felt it. You don't need prophecy to sense a reckoning. The sky had changed color. The blue that once glowed like polished glass had turned dull, clouded, metallic. The air smelled faintly of rain, though no rain fell. The rivers, oddly, began to swell, not violently but steadily, like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. In one fragment of the Book of Giants, it says simply, "The sea began to move toward the land." No drama, no divine trumpet, just water finding its way home. And that's the unsettling beauty of this part of the story. The end doesn't come as punishment. It comes as nature correcting its posture. Mahaway visited the ruins of cities that had already fallen, temples cracked, gardens drowned in dust. He saw carvings of angels and giants side by side, their faces eroded by wind. The inscriptions were prayers for mercy, but the letters themselves were fading. Even language, it seemed, was tired. He found humans still living there, thin, quiet people who stared at him with awe and fear. To them, he was both savior and omen. Some begged him to intercede with the Watchers, others threw stones, calling him the child of ruin. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The giants, too, had begun to vanish. Many had fled north, following strange instinct, perhaps sensing the flood's approach before anyone else could see it. Others, unable to endure their own guilt, had laid down in the earth, letting time and gravity take them. There's a poetic line from one of the later Manichaean versions of this myth. The sons of the sky lay down, and the mountains grew over them. It's an image both mournful and merciful, the world covering its mistakes with silence and soil. The Watchers' cities were empty now, their forges were cold. The songs of their priestesses, those haunting metallic hymns that once echoed through canyons, had fallen silent. What remained was the wind, moving through broken stone like breath through a hollow reed. Samyaza still climbed the mountain each morning, though there was nothing left to oversee. Sometimes he spoke aloud, to heaven, to no one, asking if what they'd built could still be remembered, if beauty could survive condemnation. But the sky gave no answer. That's the cruelty of this kind of judgment. It doesn't rage, it just withdraws. The fragments describe one final meeting among the Watchers, a quiet gathering beneath storm-colored clouds. No ceremony, no council, just old companions standing together as the wind rose. They spoke of their children, of the Nephilim's dreams, of the flood that Enoch had promised. Some argued, some wept, some simply stood in silence, and at the end, Samyaza said, "We gave light to the dark, and now the dark returns to claim it." It wasn't regret exactly. It was acceptance, the kind that comes when you stop believing in your own excuses. Below them, in the valleys, the rivers had begun to overflow their banks. The air was damp, heavy. The sound of distant thunder, not sharp, but low, rolling, began to echo through the mountains. Mahawe climbed up to where his father stood. He asked if there was anything left to do. Samyaza looked at him and said, "No. The time for speaking has passed. The earth listens only to itself now." That night, for the first time in generations, rain began to fall. It wasn't a storm yet, just a steady, patient drizzle, but it didn't stop. The next morning the valleys were misted over, streams became rivers, rivers became lakes, and still the sky stayed grey, unblinking, relentless. The fragments end this part simply. And the watchers beheld the waters and were afraid. That might be the most human sentence in the entire myth, because even angels, even the architects of civilizations, fear what they cannot stop. And somewhere, far below, a man named Noah began to gather wood. The rain began gently, soft enough that for a while no one believed it was the beginning of the end. At first, it even felt merciful, the air cooler, the dust settling, the smell of wet earth returning after years of dryness. The watchers stood on their mountains and watched the mist rise from the valleys like breath from the lungs of the earth. For a brief moment, they thought maybe the cleansing Enoch had promised wouldn't be destruction, but renewal. But rain that doesn't stop has a different kind of sound. After a few days, it deepens. It stops being gentle. It becomes rhythm, insistent, heavy, endless. The rivers began to climb their own banks. The streams that once sang became roaring throats of mud and foam. The humans below panicked first. They ran from the lowlands to the hills, clutching whatever they could carry. Animals fled in patterns that no one could explain, pairs and herds moving with purpose, as if the instinct of survival knew what prophecy could not teach. The watchers didn't move, they just watched. For beings who had once commanded storms, this rain was different. It wasn't divine, it was indifferent. Each drop fell without judgment, without rage, without pause. It didn't punish, it erased. Samyaza stood on the same summit where long ago he had sworn his oath, the vow that began everything. His wings hung heavy at his sides, the feathers slick and grey. His face, once bright as lightning, looked like worn stone. He whispered the names of his brothers, one by one: Azazel, Barakiel, Armoros, Penemu, Kokabel. Names that had once been bright and terrifying. Now they sounded like rain hitting rock, soft, meaningless, soon to be gone. The ancient fragments describe their lament, not as a wail or a cry, but as something quieter, heavier. It says, "And they raised their voices not to heaven, but to the earth, for they knew where judgment had come from." That's a powerful image. Angels praying downward. They confessed, though no one was there to hear them. Each told their story, how they had fallen not out of hatred, but out of fascination. How love, curiosity, and pride had blurred until they couldn't tell the difference. They weren't demons. They were what happens when awe turns to attachment. And that's what makes their story so haunting. One by one, they admitted that they had never stopped loving humanity, that their rebellion wasn't against heaven, it was an attempt to bring heaven closer. They wanted to share divine knowledge, divine beauty, divine purpose. But humans didn't need gods who lived next door. They needed mystery. They needed distance to stay human. The Watchers had forgotten that. Now, as the rain thickened and the valleys drowned, they realized that what they'd called love had been consumption. The same hunger that burned in their children. Mahaway listened from the cliffs below. His father's voice was soft, but he could still hear him through the storm. Samyaza spoke to the clouds, not to beg forgiveness, but to bear witness. "We came to guide them," he said, "but we envied their world. We looked down and wanted what they had, touch, taste, laughter, beginning and end. We thought we could live in their light without losing our own. But light shared becomes shadow, and now all is shadow." The rain poured harder. Azazel's followers had built great temples in the lowlands, enormous towers of metal and stone meant to defy the flood. The texts say the water reached their gates by the second day. By the third, the towers cracked. By the fifth, the sound of them collapsing echoed for miles. The Watchers heard it and didn't look away. There is a strange dignity in that, facing your ruin with open eyes. The fragments call it their lamentation, but it feels more like closure, the calm you find when you stop pretending you're innocent. The flood was rising faster now. The seas had joined the rain, swallowing valleys whole. Islands disappeared overnight. The horizon vanished under grey mist and restless waves. The humans screamed and prayed and built rafts that broke as soon as they touched the current. And still, the Watchers didn't move. It wasn't pride that kept them, it was memory. They had sworn to dwell upon the earth, and they would see it through. They had fallen together, and they would end together. One fragment, barely legible, reads, "They wept until the light of heaven dimmed." Scholars think it's poetic exaggeration, but maybe not. Maybe heaven really did dim, not from anger, but from grief. Mahaway climbed to his father's side. The rain had soaked through his armor. The earth beneath his feet shifted like clay. He asked what would happen to them now. Samyaza smiled faintly. "We return to silence," he said. "Everything begins there." Azazel's fate was different. The later apocrypha say he was bound beneath the desert, chained in darkness until the end of days. Others say he fled into the storm itself, his body dissolving into fire and wind. Whatever the truth, he vanished from sight. Samyaza turned once more to the sky. The clouds rolled endlessly. Somewhere, far above, he thought he saw a flicker, not light, but memory of light. He bowed his head, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. "Let it be as it must," he said. And with that, the Watchers, the great architects of knowledge and rebellion, fell silent at last. The rain kept falling. The sea kept rising, and in that endless grey, the earth began to forget their names. By the time the Watchers fell silent, the world below them had already started to dissolve. The cities of the giants, those monuments of light and arrogance, were now half submerged. The great streets turned into rivers, the towers like teeth breaking the surface of the sea. And for the first time since their creation, the Nephilim felt fear. They had been born into power, into abundance. The world had always yielded to them. Mountains bent, storms obeyed, men trembled. But now everything they had ever commanded ignored them. The skies no longer listened. The sea refused their shouts. The very air, once shaped by their voices, passed through them as if they weren't there. They were used to taking, but there was nothing left to take. Mahaway walked among them, the last giant who still spoke with calm. The others, Oya, Haya, the brothers who once dreamed of greatness, were losing themselves to despair. They tore at the walls of their palaces, trying to hold them up against the rising flood. They called to their fathers, the watchers, but no answer came, and the rain did not stop. It said that on the seventh day the earth itself split. Geysers burst from the ground, joining the rain from above. The sound was unlike anything that had come before. Not thunder, not explosion, but a constant roar. Imagine the whole planet breathing out after holding its pain for too long. The giants screamed back at it. Some cursed heaven, others cursed themselves. Some begged forgiveness from the humans they had ruled, but there was no one left to hear them. The fragments from the Book of Giants describe their despair in vivid fragments. Their hearts melted within them. They sought to ascend into the heavens, but the heavens rejected them. They sought refuge in the mountains, but the mountains fled before them. It's poetic, yes, but also deeply human. It's the sound of beings realizing that their strength means nothing against consequence. The humans who had once worshipped them were gone. The temples that bore their names had become islands. The songs that praised them were drowned by the wind, and yet they remembered their dreams, those first visions that warned them this would come. The dreams they had ignored. Oya, the oldest of the brothers, stood on a high ridge and shouted into the storm, demanding that heaven explain why they had been born only to be erased. The lightning answered, but not with words, only with light. Haya tried to build a raft from the wreckage of their city. He gathered timbers, lashed them together with rope, and urged his kin to join him. But the water was already too high, and the current pulled it apart before it left shore. He drowned clutching the half-finished vessel, his body swallowed by the flood that had no mercy to give. Mahaway stayed behind. He didn't fight the water. He watched it. The rain fell on his face, cooling the fever that had burned through generations. He thought of Enoch's words, "The earth will cleanse itself." He finally understood that the flood wasn't vengeance. It was balance, the return of silence after too much noise. He looked down into the water and saw reflections of towers, of faces, of everything that had once been brilliant and impossible. And beneath those reflections, he saw shadows moving, soft and slow. The world already reclaiming its own shape. There's a line from one of the Manichaean fragments that scholars rarely quote aloud. It reads, "And the great ones sank not in violence, but in surrender. For they knew the sea was their mother, and the sky their grave." That's the mood here. Surrender, not destruction. The moment when you stop fighting the inevitable and realize that maybe the inevitable was mercy all along. Some of the Nephilim tried to rise into the clouds, spreading their arms like wings, hoping their divine blood might lift them. But the air was heavy now, dense with water. The higher they climbed, the harder they fell. Their light flickered out mid-ascent, vanishing into the storm. The watchers watched them, helpless, silent. Samyaza wept openly. The tears, it said, turned to steam before they hit the ground. Mahaway was the last to remain standing. The flood had reached his chest, then his shoulders. Around him, the ruins of the old world floated by. Fragments of statues, metalwork, burned wood. Things once sacred, now meaningless. He lifted his face to the rain and whispered, "Forgive us our wonder." And the sea answered, not with sound but with stillness, because that's the great secret of the flood. It's not a rage, it's a return. The water doesn't destroy, it remembers. The rain went on for 40 days, or maybe it just felt that way. Time dissolves in stories like this. What matters is that when it finally stopped, there were no more voices in the wind, no more cities on the shore. Only water, endless and quiet, reflecting the grey light of a cleansed sky. The Book of Giants ends this section with a single sentence, and the last of the mighty ones bowed their heads, and the sea became calm over them. That's how their age ended, not with war or fire, but with surrender. A silence so vast it erased the line between heaven and earth, and far away, on a hill of wood and faith, a single ark floated. After the giants were gone, the world grew very still. The sea stretched out in all directions, endless, reflective, and new. The rain had stopped, but the sound of water remained, echoing through the empty valleys like the breath of something vast and alive. The mountains stood like islands now, and upon their peaks the last of the watchers remained. They had not fled. They had no reason to. There was nowhere left to go. The flood had erased everything they had touched, their cities, their altars, their children, and yet somehow that erasure felt almost merciful. The earth had not screamed, it had simply begun again. Samyaza watched from his mountain, the same place where his rebellion had begun. He no longer looked like an angel. The glow had faded from his skin. His wings hung torn and dull, but his eyes still held something, an echo of the first light he had ever seen. He knew what was coming next, for judgment in stories like this always arrives after silence. The fragments from the Book of Giants say that when the waters had settled, 4 lights appeared in the sky, each one descending like a star. They were not comets or flames, but presences. They were the archangels, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, and Gabriel, sent to finish what the flood had begun. The air trembled as they approached. The wind stilled. Even the waves seemed to draw back as if afraid to touch them. They did not come in wrath. They came in sorrow. Michael spoke first, his voice said to be as calm as deep water. He looked at Samyaza and said, "You have seen what your curiosity has wrought. The earth is cleansed, but the wound remains. You will remain with it." Raphael stepped forward. He turned to the others, Azazel's followers, those who still lingered in silence, and raised his hand. "You will not be destroyed," he said, "but bound. For even error has its purpose, and the world must remember yours." And then the binding began. The texts describe it differently, depending on who's telling the story. Some say the watchers were buried alive beneath mountains, their bodies turned to stone. Others say they were chained beneath rivers, trapped in caverns of fire and ice. But the oldest fragments, those weathered scrolls pulled from the caves near Qumran, describe something subtler, almost poetic. They were woven into the roots of the earth. That is, they became part of the world they had loved too much. Their voices faded into the wind, their tears into rain, their memory into stone. Azazel, whose defiance had burned brightest, was taken separately. Uriel, the angel of light and truth, cast him into the desert of Dudael, described as a pit of sharp stones and silent heat. There, bound hand and foot, he would remain until the end of days. It's a chilling image, but there's no anger in it, only symmetry. The rebel of light imprisoned in darkness, the giver of knowledge left alone with nothing left to know. Samyaza, meanwhile, bowed his head and said, "Let it be as it must." We loved the world too closely, and those were his last words before he, too, was taken. The fragments say he was sealed beneath the mountain itself, his body merging with the rock, his voice echoing faintly in the wind that still circles its peak. Travelers in later ages would climb those slopes and say the air hummed strangely there, as if whispering names no one remembered anymore. And maybe it still does. The archangels looked down at the waters spreading below them. Humanity had not been erased, only reduced to a seed. A few survivors, led by a man named Noah, floated on a wooden vessel far to the east. The balance had been restored, but heaven wasn't celebrating. Enoch's prophecy had been fulfilled, yes, but even heaven mourns necessity. Raphael turned to Michael and said, "Will they forget?" Michael answered, "They always do, but forgetting is mercy." And with that, the archangels rose back into the clouds, leaving the world to its quiet. For the first time in ages, the earth was still. The floodwaters reflected the pale light of dawn, and in that reflection, if one looked closely enough, faint shapes could still be seen, towers beneath the waves, figures curled in sleep, shadows that moved as though remembering what it felt like to breathe. The watchers were gone, but their story had become part of the landscape. The stones that lined riverbeds, the veins of metal beneath mountains, the whisper of wind through canyons, all of it carried their memory. Because that's the strange mercy of myth. Nothing truly vanishes, it just changes form. Even in their punishment, the Watchers were immortal, not in glory but in geology. Every echo of thunder, every glint of light on wet stone would forever sound faintly like their lament. And when the last clouds of the flood began to clear, the sky was brighter than it had been in centuries. Heaven, it seemed, had forgiven the earth, not through decree, but through distance. The first rainbow, they say, appeared that morning, a bridge of color between sky and sea, fragile but steady, a promise not that the world would never break again, but that it would always begin again. And in the quiet below, among the newly calm waters, the mountain stood watch, silent, ancient, remembering. When the rain finally stopped, the world didn't cheer. It exhaled. The sea, endless and gray, stretched to the horizon in every direction. The sky above it was pale, cloudless for the first time in years. There was no wind yet, no birds, no sound but the rhythmic pulse of waves touching mountains that had become islands. The flood had ended, not with violence but with quiet. It's strange to think of creation resetting itself. How quickly life returns to silence, how thoroughly water cleans the memory of dust. The ancient texts describe this part of the story with unexpected tenderness. They say the earth rested, as though even the planet was tired from remembering so much. Here and there pieces of the old world floated, shards of cities, fragments of metal, the tops of towers that once reached for heaven. And yet, despite the ruin, there was beauty. The surface of the water reflected light like a mirror, and from above it must have looked like the sky itself had fallen. The Watchers were gone. The giants were gone, and yet their story lingered in the stillness. Enoch's prophecy had come true. The earth had cleansed itself, and the balance between heaven and creation had been restored. But what remained was not triumph. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds both grief and peace. Far away, a single vessel drifted, a wooden ark moving slowly across the calm. Inside it, the remnant of humanity waited, unaware that their survival was the ending of one story and the beginning of another. The texts rarely mention Noah here. In the Book of Giants, he is more symbol than man, the seed of continuation, the bridge across the flood. His presence reminds us that creation always leaves a window open. Even in its darkest hour, it never chooses total erasure. The floodwaters began to recede. Mountains reappeared, familiar but smaller somehow, humbled. Rivers found new paths. The air grew warm again, heavy with the scent of wet soil and new beginnings. And as the land rose, the world began to take inventory of itself. No towers, no cities, no laughter echoing across valleys. Just wind and the murmur of new rivers finding their beds. In some versions of the story, it's said that the first rainbow appeared on that morning, a soft bridge of color stretching from one end of the sky to the other. A covenant, yes, but also a memory. The visible mark of what happens when light bends through the residue of destruction. To the surviving humans, it was a promise. To the world, it was a sigh. Scholars point out that this moment, the post-flood stillness, mirrors the beginning of Genesis. It's as though the universe had looped back on itself. The void had returned, but this time it was calm, patient, expectant. You can almost imagine the air vibrating with potential, the earth deciding what kind of life it might allow again. The places where the watchers had fallen became mountains. The ruins of the giant cities sank into the sea, where light still catches on them today in fragments of coral and stone. Legends say the bones of the Nephilim became the bedrock of continents, their shapes fossilized into the deep foundation of the world. It's poetic, isn't it? That even those who defied heaven became part of the structure of creation. The rebellion absorbed back into the order it tried to escape. There's a line from a late Persian retelling of the myth that fits perfectly here. From the bones of the mighty, the earth made its pillars, and from their size it made the wind. In other words, everything that fell became part of what held the world together. That's the hidden grace in this story. Judgment never erases entirely. It transforms. The watchers became the mountains, the giants became the soil, the flood became the memory of balance, and humanity, fragile as it was, became the inheritor of both error and wonder. Somewhere above the waters, Enoch watched, unseen. In later myths, it's said that he did not die, but was taken up, transformed into something that could move freely between realms. He became the scribe of heaven, the archivist of all that had been, and perhaps, as the floodwaters receded, he was already writing this moment, the pause between worlds. The air shimmered, the sun broke through for the first time, scattering light across the water, and as it did, the surface seemed to ripple with faint shapes, the suggestion of faces, voices, laughter long gone, echoes of the world before still dreaming beneath the waves. Because stories like this never end, they settle. And so the new earth opened its eyes. The soil was clean again, the wind carried no names, the rivers, freed from their boundaries, ran where they pleased. It wasn't paradise, but it was peace. The flood had not destroyed the world, it had washed away its fever, and as the survivors stepped out onto the damp earth, somewhere deep beneath their feet, the voices of the old world sighed and fell silent at last. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Forgotten World. There's a kind of silence that follows endings, not emptiness but balance. It's the hush that lingers after a storm when the world feels newly made. You can almost hear the sound of the earth breathing again, slow and steady. That's where we begin this final chapter, not in destruction, but in stillness. The floodwaters had receded, the clouds had thinned, the first rays of sunlight touched the wet soil, warm and golden like a benediction. The survivors, the small handful of humans chosen or simply lucky enough to endure, stood at the edge of a world that no longer remembered itself. The air smelled of rain and wood and clean stone. The rivers glittered with fragments of the old world, shards of pottery, broken metal, driftwood shaped by long patience, and above it all, the sky stretched wide and quiet, unbroken by thunder. The watchers were gone. The giants were gone. And yet somehow their story remained, not in ruins or relics, but in rhythm. Because that's how memory works. When the world forgets, it doesn't lose, it transforms. The same patterns that once brought the watchers to earth, curiosity, ambition, desire, still stirred within the hearts of those who survived. The same urge to build, to understand, to reach for the stars. The flood had cleansed the surface, but not the spirit. And that's the quiet truth of the story. Nothing is ever erased completely. Imagine standing there at dawn on the first day of a new earth, the ground still soft beneath your feet, the world still damp and shimmering. The birds haven't returned yet, but you can feel them coming. The silence hums with potential, a symphony waiting to be born again. The people looked to the sky, but it was empty now. No angels, no signs, no thunder, only light. And perhaps that was the lesson all along. The heavens don't always speak in words or fire. Sometimes their silence is the answer. One ancient text says that in the days after the flood, the earth was heavy with memory. That's such a beautiful line, as if the soil itself carried the weight of what it had witnessed. The people who tilled it didn't know why it felt sacred, only that it did. They began to build again, slowly. Simple shelters at first, fires to keep warm. They carved new names for the months and stars. They told their children stories of a time when the sky opened and giants walked among them. But the stories changed. With each retelling they softened. The watchers became gods. The giants became heroes. The flood became legend. That's what time does. It rounds the edges of grief. It's easy to imagine Enoch watching all this from above, recording the new beginning with the same calm hand he used to write of the end. In his view, there was no contradiction, only continuity. One age fading into another, one silence making space for new voices. Some of the fragments even suggest that Enoch wept as he wrote those final lines, not out of sadness, but out of awe, because he understood that this was what creation was always meant to be, a rhythm of birth, fall, and renewal. And in that rhythm, even ruin had purpose. The rivers whispered as they wound through the valleys, the air smelled of ash and growth. The stars returned, faint but steady, their reflections dancing on the new lakes. The world was quiet, yes, but not lifeless. It was waiting. Somewhere beneath the soil, the echoes of the old world still lingered. The bones of the Nephilim, the sealed watchers, the buried cities of light, all sleeping now, deep within the earth. And sometimes, when the wind passed over the mountains, it made a sound like a sigh, as if the world itself remembered what it had once carried and forgave it. Because that's the quiet miracle of survival. You can't rebuild until you've learned how to forgive. The people who came after the flood would forget the names, but not the feeling. They would tell their own stories of gods who walked the earth, of fallen stars, of a time when the heavens and humans shared a single language. Every civilization after this one, Sumerian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, would retell the same myth in a new accent. That's why the Book of Giants feels so familiar. It's not just an ancient text, it's a pattern, one we keep repeating, one the earth keeps humming beneath its breath. Even now, when we dream of lost worlds or fallen stars, we're remembering them. And in that sense, the silence after the flood isn't the end of the story. It's the pause between verses. The first birds began to sing. The rivers glimmered under the dawn. The wind carried warmth again, and the sky seemed wider than ever. The world was ready to begin again. Enoch was never supposed to be a hero. He wasn't a warrior or a king. He didn't command armies or forge empires. His power was quieter, the kind that comes from observation, not conquest. And maybe that's why heaven chose him. When the watchers fell and the earth cried out beneath the weight of their brilliance, Enoch became something rare, a witness who could move between realms without belonging entirely to either. He was human enough to understand fear, but close enough to the divine to see beyond it. The old texts say he was taken up into the heavens, body and soul, without death. That's the image most people remember. Enoch walking beneath a darkening sky, his footprints fading as he steps into light. But the Book of Giants gives a different glimpse. It says that even after his ascension, his voice lingered, whispering through wind and dream, guiding those who still listened. He had written everything, the secrets of the watchers, the warnings of heaven, the memories of the flood, and those writings didn't disappear with him. Some say he sealed them in the mountains, others say he scattered them across the desert, knowing they'd only be found when the world was ready again. Centuries later, fragments of those scrolls would resurface, buried in jars, wrapped in linen, preserved by dry air and divine indifference. Scholars would call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, but to Enoch they were simply his diary, the record of what happens when light forgets its limits. It's fascinating, isn't it? How a voice from the dawn of myth still murmurs through time. You can almost feel it, even now, that sense of cosmic melancholy, the strange calm that comes from knowing you've seen too much and understood too little. Enoch didn't curse the watchers, he pitied them. In one fragment he writes, "They looked upon beauty and forgot that beauty is not possession." That single sentence feels like the moral of an entire civilization, and maybe it's the moral of ours too. He was, above all else, a scribe, and scribes are not creators of truth, but keepers of it. His role was not to judge, but to remember. The flood may have washed away the world, but Enoch's memory became its seed. The later mystics said he was transformed into Metatron, the voice of heaven, the one who records the deeds of all souls. But that's a later title, a poetic afterthought. In the Book of Giants, he's still human, compassionate, weary, endlessly patient. The kind of presence that doesn't demand belief, only listening. Imagine him now watching the new world unfold, the survivors building fires, planting seeds, learning again how to name the stars, the sky still wet with color, the earth still breathing steam. Enoch doesn't interfere. He observes, he writes. There's a quiet satisfaction in that. He knows the rhythm now, rise, fall, renewal. He's seen the cycle play out enough times to understand that perfection was never the goal. Balance was. One late manuscript describes him sitting beside a river in heaven, dipping his quill into light instead of ink. Every time the river ripples, another age begins below, and when it stills, an age ends. He doesn't control it, he just keeps track. It's a comforting image. The idea that someone, somewhere, is keeping the story intact, that even if we forget, even if time erases the details, the essence is never lost, because that's what Enoch represents. Continuity, the bridge between the divine and the human, the eternal and the temporary, the promise that knowledge can survive catastrophe as long as someone remembers to write it down. And maybe that's why the Book of Giants still resonates. It's not about angels and monsters, not really. It's about memory, about how stories outlive those who live them. The flood passed, the world moved on, but the writings remained, buried, fragmented, waiting. When they were found again thousands of years later, scholars argued over their meaning. Were they myth, history, allegory? No one could agree. But perhaps that uncertainty is the point. Maybe Enoch never wanted to be understood, only remembered, because understanding is temporary, memory is eternal. The earth itself seems to agree. Its layers, rock, soil, fossil, ash, are like pages in an endless book. Each catastrophe, each rebirth, another chapter, and buried deep within those pages, faint as breath, lies the story Enoch began. The story of the ones who fell and the ones who learned to rise again. When the wind moves over mountains, when rivers carve through stone, when lightning splits the sky, somewhere in those echoes, his words are still being written, not by hand anymore, but by time. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of scripture. Not one you read, but one you live inside. The world below was new again, but the rhythm was old. Creation forgets, then remembers, always. And as the first stars appeared in the cleansed sky, Enoch, wherever he was, kept writing. Every story that endures carries a hidden pulse, a meaning that breathes beneath the surface of its symbols. The Book of Giants is no different. On the surface, it's the tale of angels and monsters, of divine rebellion and divine retribution. But beneath it, something quieter is beating. What if it was never really about heaven versus earth at all? What if it was about what happens when knowledge outpaces wisdom? The giants weren't born evil. They were born from wonder, from the meeting of the infinite and the finite, of light and soil. They were living contradictions, too large for the world that birthed them, too human for the heaven that made them. And that more than anything might be what doomed them. Their story feels ancient, but familiar, because humanity has been replaying it ever since. Every time we build something we don't yet understand, every time we chase beauty without patience, we're echoing that same song. The same fall disguised as progress. The giants consumed too much food, land, worship, knowledge, because they could. They mistook abundance for immortality. They thought power was purpose. It's not hard to see the reflection. The flood then isn't just divine judgment. It's the world's immune system resetting itself after fever. The earth wasn't angry. It was overwhelmed, and in that sense the story becomes less about punishment and more about healing. The Watchers taught mankind to make weapons, to write spells, to read the stars. They gave away divine secrets without context, knowledge without humility. The giants inherited that imbalance. They were the embodiment of brilliance without restraint, and when brilliance forgets restraint, it collapses. Maybe that's why these stories survive, because they remind us that every civilization, no matter how advanced, carries its own flood inside it. There's a fragment from the Book of Giants that scholars rarely quote because it's incomplete. But what remains is striking. It says, "The sons of the sky looked upon their works and wept, for they had built beauty upon sand." That's the tragedy, isn't it? Not destruction, but impermanence. The realization that even perfection can't endure when it forgets where it came from. The giants were born of longing. The Watchers fell because they wanted to be close to life, to feel, to taste, to touch. There's tenderness in that, a kind of divine homesickness. And maybe that's what makes their fall so heartbreaking. They didn't descend out of malice, they descended out of love. But love without understanding can be just as destructive as hate. The earth, in its way, was trying to teach that. And so, When the flood came, it wasn't an act of vengeance, but of mercy. The story says the earth cried out for release, not from evil, but from imbalance. The water wasn't rage, it was remedy. That's the quiet paradox of the myth. The flood kills, but it also heals. It ends a world, but saves the planet. It silences the voices of power so that smaller, gentler ones can be heard again. If you listen closely, the Book of Giants is less about punishment and more about proportion, the eternal dance between creation and collapse. And in that dance, the giants become symbols, not of monsters, but of excess. They are what happens when divine ambition forgets to kneel. That's not so different from us. We build cities that touch the clouds. We split atoms, teach machines to think, reach into the stars, and then wonder why the ground shakes. We call it progress. But sometimes, if you listen closely, it sounds like the same thunder that rolled over Mount Hermon when the Watchers fell. But there's comfort in that realization too, because if the story of the giants is also our story, then their ending doesn't have to be ours. The flood didn't wipe out the spark of curiosity. It refined it. It taught creation how to grow within limits, how to wonder without devouring. Maybe that's what Enoch meant when he wrote, "Their sin was not in knowing, but in forgetting what knowing costs." Knowledge isn't the enemy, forgetfulness is. The giants remind us that even the greatest light casts a shadow, and that the purpose of myth is not to frighten us away from power, but to teach us how to hold it gently. Every age has its watchers and its giants, those who climb too high, those who dream too large, those who forget that wisdom and humility must walk hand in hand. But the story assures us that even after every fall, the world can begin again. And that, perhaps, is the greatest secret of all. The flood always ends, the world always dries, and life, foolish, radiant, endlessly curious life, always finds its way back to the surface. Even after the flood had receded, the story of the giants didn't vanish. It lingered, quietly, stubbornly, like a song that refuses to leave your head, even after the music stops. You can trace its echo across continents, through centuries, across languages that never met. Every culture somehow remembers something. In Mesopotamia, the ancient scribes told of the apocryphal, semi-divine sages who descended from heaven to teach humanity the arts of civilization, only to be punished when their wisdom led to pride. In Greece, they became the Titans, massive beings who defied the gods and were buried beneath the earth. In the Bible, they are the Nephilim, the mighty ones of old, men of renown. In Persia, the Devs. In India, the Asuras. In the north, the Jotun. Different names, same melody. It's almost as if every civilization inherited the same dream or the same warning, but told it with their own accent. The idea of divine beings falling to earth, mingling with mortals, and giving birth to something extraordinary. It's too compelling to forget. It sits at the crossroads of fascination and fear, the belief that brilliance and ruin are separated by only a few steps, and maybe that's why the story survived. Because it's not just about the past, it's about us. The ancients didn't have satellites or telescopes, but they looked up at the stars and felt the same questions we feel now. Where did we come from? Who taught us to build? Who gave us language, fire, dreams? And why do we sometimes feel like we're remembering rather than discovering? That's the echo of the Watchers, not in stone or scripture, but in instinct. The quiet suspicion that knowledge might not have begun here. When the scrolls of Enoch resurfaced in the 20th century, fragile and half-burned, tucked inside clay jars near the Dead Sea, the world rediscovered this ancient whisper. The fragments of the Book of Giants were among them, lines about fallen angels, prophetic dreams, and the sons of heaven devouring the earth. Scholars called it myth, the faithful called it revelation, but the truth, as always, rests somewhere between poetry and memory. Because myth isn't a lie we tell about the past, it's a truth we repeat in disguise. From the deserts of Judea to the monasteries of Tibet, you find variations of the same vision, hidden worlds beneath the earth, luminous beings who guide from below, floods that reset the balance when the world forgets humility. In some places, they called that realm Agartha or Shambhala. In others, it was simply called the Beneath. And that's what makes the Book of Giants so haunting. It doesn't feel like invention. It feels like recollection, like the earth itself remembering one of its previous versions. When you look at ancient ruins, the Cyclopean stones of Baalbek, the buried cities beneath the sands of Turkey, the forgotten architecture that defies explanation, it's tempting to wonder, were these the remnants of the age of the giants? Maybe not literally, but symbolically, absolutely, because every great civilization eventually becomes a myth in someone else's story. Rome, Egypt, Babylon, all giants once, now sleeping beneath dust. And maybe that's the pattern the ancients were trying to teach us, that every empire is a footstep on a much older path. Enoch's voice, if we imagine it echoing through time, doesn't sound angry. It sounds patient, as if he knew we'd forget and then remember again and forget once more. It's a gentle cycle, the amnesia of creation. The Manichaeans, centuries later, rewrote the Book of Giants through the lens of light and darkness, cosmic forces eternally entwined. They said the fallen ones weren't lost souls, but fragments of divine light trapped in matter, waiting to be purified through time. That's a comforting thought, that even mistakes can be redeemed by endurance. And so the myth traveled, adapting, surviving. It shaped Gnostic hymns, Islamic lore, medieval angelology, and Renaissance art. It inspired mystics, poets, even early scientists who wondered whether the Earth's bones were literally those of ancient giants. Each retelling softened the tragedy, turning it from catastrophe into metaphor. The Watchers stopped being villains and became mirrors. The giants stopped being monsters and became lessons. And the flood, that endless rain that erased the world, became a symbol for every cleansing that follows excess. We still talk about floods today. Floods of information, floods of greed, floods of progress that rise too quickly for us to swim through. The language changes, but the pattern doesn't. The water always returns when we forget our balance. Maybe that's why the story refuses to die. It's not ancient history. It's an operating manual for being human. And somewhere, perhaps in the quiet of the night, when the world is still and your mind begins to wander, you can almost feel it, the pulse of that old story beneath your feet, beating faintly through the earth. A reminder that everything we build sits on the bones of what came before, and everything we dream has already been dreamed once, long ago, by beings who looked at the stars and wondered what it would feel like to fall. The older the world gets, the quieter its stories become. They stop shouting from mountaintops and start whispering through the cracks of stone, through wind, through the rhythm of your own heartbeat. That's where the Book of Giants truly lives now, not in scripture, not in ruins, but in that silent place beneath thought where memory and imagination blur. because the story was never really about angels and monsters. It was about light and what happens when light forgets where it came from. The watchers fell because they wanted to share that light too eagerly. The giants rose because they carried it without understanding its weight. And the flood came because the world needed darkness again, to rest, to begin anew. Every age has its own flood, its own fall, its own rediscovery of balance, and every person, in their own way, repeats it. We all have our watchers, the higher parts of ourselves that look down, curious, tempted by the beauty of the material world. We all have our giants, the parts that hunger, that build, that consume until they break. And we all have our floods, the moments that wash us clean, when everything we thought mattered dissolves into silence. But after every flood, there's always the same dawn, gentle, patient, forgiving. That's the hidden light of this story, not the brilliance that blinds, but the kind that glows quietly, steady and small, the kind that lives inside you. The old mystics believed that the divine spark which once burned in the watchers never truly vanished. They said it settled into humanity itself, scattered like embers across every living soul. That's why we dream of impossible things, why we reach for stars, why we're never content with the surface of the world. We are, in some strange way, their continuation, their redemption. When you look at the night sky, you're seeing both sides of the story, the height from which they fell, and the home they hoped to build on earth. The stars are not just lights, they're reminders, silent ones, watching back. And maybe that's what Enoch meant to preserve, not just memory, but the invitation to remember ourselves. He wrote of angels and floods and divine consequence, but between every line is a quieter message. Balance is sacred, wonder is holy, but humility keeps it alive. And even those who fall can become part of what sustains the world. It's comforting, isn't it, to imagine that even the mistakes of heaven found a purpose, that the ruins of the old world became the foundation of the new. When you walk through forests, when you touch the earth, when you feel the hum beneath your feet, you're touching the aftermath of every age that came before, the layered memory of creation still unfolding. That's what the Book of Giants truly teaches, that nothing is ever lost, only transformed. The giants became mountains, the watchers became whispers, the flood became renewal, and the light, the one they carried too close, became the spark in every one of us. The next time you look into a fire, notice how the flames flicker and sway, each one a fragment of something ancient, each one a reminder of what once burned too brightly, but it doesn't need to consume anymore. It just glows, softly, patiently. That's the right kind of light, not divine, not human, just alive. And if you close your eyes now and listen, maybe you can hear it, that old rhythm still echoing, the rise, the fall, the renewal, the song that began before words and will outlast them. The world has been remade countless times. It will be remade countless times more. But the story, like the hidden light within it, never truly ends. It only rests, waiting for someone new to remember. So rest with it. Let the water grow still, let the echoes fade. The flood has passed. The world is clean again. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface, the giants sleep in peace, dreaming of light